All right, so we're going to talk about just land grabbing today, because I'm going to go over green militarization tomorrow. The video that I want you guys to see kind of goes more into the person aspect of land grabbing, and I want you guys to actually watch that because it's actually a really good video. So, um, but land grabbing is a rush for land or resources. And as the slide says, it's used by some governments and corporations to meet their needs, usually agricultural or energetic needs. So the resources that are usually rushed for are things like water, minerals. There is also a thing called green grabbing, which is more of a land grab for environmental usage, um, which we'll go into later. So when we're talking about land grabbing, the land that is grabbed is usually grabbed by another country. So, for example, the United States goes into Cambodia and then purchases a whole bunch of land, um, works out a deal with the government, and the local people that are on that land are usually evicted. Typically, it depends. There is compensation for the most part because nowadays you can't evict people in such a big way without providing them some money. And usually, the companies or the governments provide or promise that they are going to provide alternative livelihoods, usually by working for them. But that all depends pretty heavily on a lot of factors, and it usually doesn't fall out that way. Okay, yes. So this is a graph, and I'm not sure if you guys are able to see that as big as I would want it to be, but we're just going to look at it. I'll just describe what's happening. So on the y-axis, you have different categories that these people looked over. Property system, the land use pre-acquisition by the land grabbers, the people that are affected, the land use post-acquisition. So what did the grabbers do with the land afterwards? The kind of acquirers that actually grab the land, the acquisition mechanism. So did they purchase it? Did they lease it from the government? Whether the government actually favored the acquisition and whether there was coercion involved. And coercion in this case can actually mean a whole bunch of different things. Because coercion isn't just, for example, going in with armed guards and telling people that they're not allowed to be on the land anymore. Coercion could be psychological, um, it could be financial, and governments and corporations use this a lot, use all kinds of coercion to get people off the land that they want. So what we're seeing on the x-axis is the percentage of studies, and they looked at 56 case studies. And so what you see is that typically the property system before acquisition it's a common property. So it's not necessarily titled to any specific person. And in that case, even if people live on the land and they may have ancestral rights to the land, the government doesn't recognize their rights to the land, and so it's leased off. Typically, the land use pre-acquisition is a small farm, and in those cases, you're thinking about locals farming little patches of land for a couple years and then moving on to another patch of land. And while they're on the other patch of land, the first patch of land kind of grows up and provides habitat to more early successional habitat to species. The users are affected are typically smallholders, so people that have these small farms. There's also indigenous people on there. There's that's 11 case studies, so almost 25% of all the case studies. The land use post acquisition tends to be food crops. And when we're talking about food crops, we're probably talking about flex crops, which are things that you can use either for food for people, food for animals, or you can use for biofuel. So things like sugarcane, palm oil, etc. And stop me if you guys have any questions. I'm actually being really smooth with this delivery and I'm going pretty fast. So yeah, people who acquire the land is usually a foreign company. Occasionally it's a domestic company, but for the most part, 50% of the case studies show that it's a foreign company. And the acquisition purchase is usually through the government, so the lease from the government. And that's where that common property sense of property system kind of goes into play, because again, even if people had lived on that land for hundreds of years, their family had lived on it, etc., if they don't have an exact title, the government's not going to recognize their right to the land. And a lot of times the government favors the acquisition. And this is typically because what happens is that these are people from the global north, United States, Israel, Europe, etc., that are coming into much poorer countries. So, for example, there's going to be a case study that we'll look over that is in Sierra Leone. And these governments or these corporations are promising a lot of money for this land. And they're also promising development. So they're promising infrastructure, they're promising jobs, etc. And the government thinks that this is a good deal. So they'll usually favor it. And then the coercion, we have the highest one, about over 25%, is coercion, no conflict. So that typically means that things didn't come to like armed or standoffs or anything like that. But there are 13 case studies that reported conflict with violence. This is from another study that looked at specifically water grabbing. And this can mean either grabbing land that has a bunch of aquifers or or has access to water, or land that actually gets a lot of rainwater. So you're thinking about, I think there's two different terms for it. So blue water grabbing is when the water is actually just standing. So you're thinking of access to riverbanks. So, for example, there was another case study that I read that I didn't put in this PowerPoint, but what you see is that a whole bunch of corporations bought up the land around this river in Sudan. And so now the small farm holders in the Sudanese small farm holders can't access the river because these corporations have bought up the rights to the river, basically. And then you have green water, which is when you're in a place where there's a lot of rainwater typically, or there's supposed to be a lot of rainwater. And so you don't necessarily have to worry about irrigation or blue water. But what we see here is what I put down in the notes. Africa and Asia tends to be a lot of the water that's actually grabbed. So we could see that these circles, as they get bigger, that means that there's more area that has been grabbed. And these green lines are supposed to connect the area that's grabbed to the red triangles, which are the grabbers. But this is a mess of, of a diagram, and I kind of wish that they had done a little bit better. But we see that the red triangles are typically Canada, United States. We have red triangles in Brazil, and then we also have some grab land in Brazil. So people or countries can be grabbers and grabbees. We have a lot of red triangles in Europe. We have some red triangles in Northern Africa and the Middle East, China, Southeast Asia. And for the most part, we tend to have a lot of grab land in, oh, also Australia. And then also Australia is also a country that has land being grabbed or water being grabbed. But we tend to see a lot of grabbing without being a grabber in Africa and in Asia. And then 60% of the water grabbed, as you can read on the side, is typically done by the US, the United or Arab Emirates, India, Egypt, China, Israel, UK. And so water is supposed to be a pretty important resource in the future. And water is also a human right. The access to fresh drinking water is a human right. And you need water to grow things, right? So if you have this land and this access to water being purchased and sold to foreign countries, you got to wonder what the locals are going to do um, now or in the future when they need to get access to water. Are they going to have to pay these companies or governments to actually access the water that's right in their backyards, or are they just not going to get access to it? So I mentioned green grabbing a little bit earlier in this PowerPoint, and green grabbing is just land grabbing in the name of the environment. So one particular form of green grabbing that we've studied throughout this course is protected areas. But there are other examples, and I mentioned this before, flex crops. So the biofuel, oh dear, the biofuel movement, um, companies who are looking to get into the industry of making biofuels, uh, this can be called green grabbing because biofuels are supposed to be better for the environment. So if you grab land in efforts to actually grow biofuel crops, you're being green in a sense. Um, so yeah, so shifting from food production to biofuel production can cause food shortages. And the reason that land grabbing is rather well known today is because in, I think it was 2012, sometime between 2008 and 2012, there was an economic recession that influenced the globe, if I remember correctly. I was an undergrad at that time, so I wasn't really paying attention. But this is when people realized that their prices spiked for food in the global south. And this was because all of this agricultural land was actually grabbed and was being used to produce biofuel or food for global north countries. So this is when people first realized that all of this land was being grabbed by either governments or corporations, and they first started reporting on it. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Okay, so case study. This is the Sierra Leone case study that I mentioned earlier. And what we see here is Adex Bioenergy is a Swiss corporation. They decided to lease 220 miles square of prime agricultural land from the Sierra Leone government. And the government jumped on that, of course, because at the time that they had leased it, they had just gotten over the Ebola crisis. And even without Ebola, Sierra Leone was a pretty poor country. There's a lot of conflict. And addicts promised, again, there would be infrastructure, there would be development, there would be jobs for locals. And in this way, they actually got the locals to agree, for the most part, to being pushed off of their agricultural lands, their farmlands, their family and communal farmlands, because they were hoping that this corporation would get them steady jobs that would pay more than farming. 13,000 people were affected. And again, like I mentioned, they promised that locals would be employed with steady jobs. And they also promised that like at least half of that 220 miles square would be used for community farmland. So people would still be able to farm. And then the other half would be used for sugarcane production. But what it turned out to be was that even though there were community farmland plots, for the most part, they were much further from people than they could actually travel. So it wasn't easy to access them. And then the jobs that were provided, there are like 2,000 jobs at one point. So you compare that to 13,000 people affected, right? These jobs were temporary. They were about 2 to 3 months, and they paid them $2 to $3 a day, which was not enough for them to live on. And then, yeah, so they sort of left them in the lurch. So these people were mostly farmers. They were dependent on their farms for feeding their families and feeding themselves. And so when the company bought this land and provided them these farms that they couldn't access, um, they have no other, like they have no backup, right? So they are finding it harder to get to these farms, and they're finding it harder to actually farm and maintain their farms enough that they can have food. The jobs that they were hoping for turned out to be temporary and poor paying. And then they usually tended to be during the farming, like the major farming season, the major growing season. So you could either go work at this job and completely neglect your farm if you can get to it, or you can go and hope that you can farm well enough to make food for your family. And so in the end, it turned out that a lot of people got like became hungry. They became malnourished because of um, they had depended on the corporation to give them these jobs that they promised, and it turned out that they didn't get enough money to provide for themselves. Does anyone have any questions before we start this video? God, it was that. No questions? Is everyone good? Okay. So yeah, um, I did want to kind of go into just really briefly what that guy, I think his name is Carlito, said about food aid and will they provide food 10 to 20 years from now. I mean, um, this, like, people, I don't know if it's just an American thing or if it's a thing that is embedded in human society, but people don't tend to like people who are poor and people who need help. And I can easily see um, the Brazilian government, however many years from then, I guess this was shot in 2005 or something like that, um, saying that, it's not our fault that these people are poor. They should be able to go out and get jobs, et cetera, and just completely take food aid away. That would totally fit in with history and what has happened in the past. So um, it kind of screwed. Either way, we'll end on this takeaway. This is just one last chart from this chapter in a book that I read. So we see that again, we have broken down by regions, the number of concluded deals for green grabbing, and the size of the land that's been taken. And we see huge amounts of millions of hectares being taken, mostly in Africa, um, but there are a lot in Asia and Latin America and Eastern Europe as well. So 26.7 million hectares since 2017 have been taken in green grabbing deals. Either way, just based on how people react to perceived scarcity. And I'm saying perceived because if you remember what I was saying last lecture, we do have enough food at this moment to feed everybody. Um, we have enough land to take care of everybody if people stop over consuming. And, but it seems like people are more likely to believe that there's um, only so many resources and that those resources are scarce. And when people feel that resources are scarce, they tend to rush and try and get what they can, either to protect themselves or to profit. So if you guys remember last year when the pandemic first started, a lot of people were rushing, um, buying hand sanitizer, buying toilet paper, etc. I remember going around here for a couple weeks and I could not purchase hand sanitizer for anything. So I ended up just using alcohol, rubbing alcohol. uh, and I remembered also that in those first couple of weeks, month, the New York Times wrote this article on this guy who basically bought like a store's worth of hand sanitizer and was selling it at an incredible markup. And so he was looking to profit. And that's what people do when people think that there's danger ahead or that there are resources that are just going to be limited. People grab for themselves or to make money. So I'm sure that land grabbing is going to continue in the future and it's going to probably increase. Um, the project are the people, the governments, the corporations that promise things for locals if they allow themselves to be evicted. These promises often fall short, as you remember with the Sierra Leone case study. Um, and of course, local livelihoods can be destroyed. So we saw that the Guarani, hoping I'm saying that right, Guarani indigenous people, they were able to feed themselves, they were able to provide for themselves, and then their lands were taken and used for sugar cane, and now they depend on food aid, and they're facing malnutrition. Um, I'm assuming they're facing a lot of diseases. They're also facing incredibly incredibly unhealthy working conditions. So and then it seems that their way of life is also falling apart. So that is all I have for today. And show. So again, we have stop share. Again, we have so I didn't check, but are they still facing the conditions today or has anything changed since the video? So I didn't check, but we know that the Brazilian government now is not friendly towards indigenous people at all. So I wouldn't be surprised if the conditions have actually worsened. Um, yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?